This is how it works. We're going to talk you through it from the start. So this is sourdough fermentation in here, right? So there's two ways of making bread, the old way and the new way. The new way, roughly, can be described as using brewer's yeast, all right? So a cultured yeast. All yeast is just fungus, the microscopic fungi, and as they recreate or reproduce, they eat sugars and starches, of which you find inside the flour. So as we've discussed already, you should really need to add sugar to your dough, because the yeast will be quite happy to eat the starch that's inside the flour. Now, what we do in terms of sourdough, when we're talking about sourdough, is we're using a wild yeast, okay? There is yeast all about us in the air that we breathe, in the world. It's just there. It's part of making the world function. So in here, I've just got a mixture that's 50% flour, 50% water, and we call that a starter or a leaven, okay? Now, this is an active leaven because it's got inside, I inoculated it with a couple of tablespoons of my starter from home. Alright? Now all I did was mix flour and water together about 5 years ago and leave them at room temperature in my kitchen with a damp J-cloth or tea towel over the top in a tub like that. You know, I could have probably done it in a beautiful glass jar with a piece of muslin tied over the top and some brown string, but it wasn't how I felt. So I went with a plastic tub, mixed it, and I left it. And after about a week I was like, it's not fermenting, it's just nonsense, it's never going to happen. And after 2 weeks, something started to happen, so I threw some away and then I mixed up some fresh and I added it to the old and that fed it, and it started getting going. And after about a year, I ended up with a really nice sourdough starter. And that fermentation culture is entirely down to the prevalent yeasts that are in the air in my kitchen. Matt. He's been going for about probably about 12 hours now with some fermentation. It's really just starting to get going nicely now, and you can smell it. It's quite fruity. It's a bit like when you walk into a vineyard and then you go on the wine tour. I don't know if you can. I can never remember them really because by the time you've done the tasting, it's all gone out the window. But if you cast your mind back, if you've ever been on a vineyard, when you walk into that sort of fermentation chamber where they're letting the wine brew, that's that kind of fruity aroma that you kind of get. So it's coming off there, we've got some carbon dioxide, we've got the flavour and the smell of the flour and the yeast, and it's really got a bit of character to it, and that's where the sour flavour comes from in the dough. Okay? This gets going. I put about 500 grams of this with about 800 grams of flour and about 450 grams of water, 20 grams of salt. And then I'll leave that, make it into a dough, and then I'll pop it in the fridge and I'll let it ferment overnight, and it comes up into a nice sticky dough like this. Here is one I made earlier. Alright? And that's my sourdough. Now if I pass that round, you'll be able to really smell that same as you could smell in here, but much more strongly. Okay, it's really getting going. And the baguette dough is slightly different. I'm using a traditional fermentation, so this is a yeasted fermentation here. And actually, I won't pass it around because it's too big, but if you stick your head in there at some point, you'll be able to tell immediately there's a completely different flavour going to come out of that dough because it smells completely different. So we're going to use some of that, we're going to use some of this, we're going to add some plain flour, some strong flour, a little bit of water and some salt. We're going to make that up into a baguette dough, and then we're going to divide that. We're going to take some home. I've brought some little plastic bags for the purpose. You can take some home, because then, if you wanted to, you could bake the rest when you get home. It makes a good pizza dough too, so maybe you can have pizza for supper. We're always just thinking of you, that's what we do. You get dough finger quite a lot when you're baking, okay? And whose hands, I know you need to be honest now, hands up whose kitchen is constantly pristine? No one? Or you're just not going to fall into my trap? Okay, you cannot allow bread into your life and fuss too much about how brilliantly clean the kitchen is, okay? Because you're going to have tubs of stuff fermenting away in the fridge, a little bit of flour probably sprinkled on the floor, although if you've got Labrador, they're quite handy for clearing that up. You have to have a range cooker. You can't make good bread without an ESSE range cooker. That's something we all need to remember today, okay? So when you're making a baguette, have you ever noticed they're a bit softer? Yeah? That's because we use plain flour instead of strong flour, or half and half actually. So the difference between plain flour and strong flour is very simple. Strong flour has a lot more of the strong sort of protein in it, gluten. This one, bread flour. Plain flour has a lot less, okay? Because it's from what we call a lower grade wheat. because it doesn't need to hold too much structure. We use plain flour for things like pancakes and pastry, where it's all sort of either quite firm or quite soft. And if it's firm, it's held together with something else. When we're making bread, we need to capture gas inside a spongy mass of dough. It needs to have a bit of flexibility, a bit of elasticity about it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So another 150 grams of this. Salt. Okay? We all know, don't we, that salt is bad for us. Right? It's also good for us. We can't live without salt. Okay? We would cease to function. The thing about salt is that as long as you know it's there and you put it there and you can taste it, it's fine. It's when people take charge of the salt for you that you've got a problem. And I'm not talking necessarily about chefs in the kitchen, I'm talking more about processed foods. So I'm going to go with 5 grams of salt. And that sounds like quite a lot, but it's not very much compared to the amount of flour we've got. And if you don't put salt in the bread, it will taste bland. Okay? Yeah, just a sec. I'm just going to gently remove my sourdough from its, we could say plastic tub, but I think it sounds so much nicer if you say fermentation chamber. And then I'm going to divide it out. Okay? And this will be the bigger one. And then I'm gently, without knocking too much of the air out of it, I'm going to spread it out a little bit. Okay? You can see all those big bubbles in there. It looks great. Now I want to try and, some people call this cheating, but it's just good baking, okay? I'm going to try and flip it over all into the middle to create a nice round shape, so it's got nice lots of layers of dough in it. And at the same time I'm going to attempt to catch a little bit of air inside. Because if it starts off with little pockets of air in it, as it ferments, those pockets of air are just going to get bigger. Okay, so we're not excluding the air. Traditional, modern baking, if you like, it's all about a consistent product with a fine grain, and the last thing they would want is to trap a big bubble of air in there, okay, because they want just everything to look the same. We don't, we want it all to be a bit more interesting and exciting. So before it all sticks to the table, we're just going to flip it over into the middle. Okay, and then I'm just going to sort of slightly repeat that process just to tighten the dough up a little bit around the edges. And I'm just working on a tiny bit of semolina here. There's no major secrets there. There it is, done. A little bit more semolina over the top. Proving basket. Dip it in there. Great. I can chuck that over there, leave it to prove, put a tea towel over it or something, put it somewhere. So here's one, and although it's not quite there, it looks quite soft now, right? So we've got to look at that and think, all right, we need to be gentle with this, okay? Because we don't want to, having spent all that time, so 24 hours roughly to make a loaf of sourdough, in this case, because I've fridged it overnight, 12 to 14 hours would be the minimum time at room temperature, from starter to leaven to dough to final proof. I don't want to then just carelessly tip it out, knock all the air out of it and kind of spoil it, all right? So we just got to think about what we're doing a little bit, connect with it. Now I'm going to get this tray out of the oven. Now this is a hot tray. This is a good thing. This helps us give it what we call an oven spring, okay? At home, if you've just had the bathroom done, it's worth keeping hold of a couple of those floor tiles, getting them cut to the same size as your oven shelf. Just pop them in there. They're really good for baking on, all right? Today we haven't got that, so I'm just going to put some semolina on a nice... it's going to start smoking. We're going to set off this fire alarm. We're going to be evacuated from the building. There's my loaf. There's a razor blade on the end of a piece of plastic. You can get nice wooden ones. I've got a nice wooden one. Just going to cut that. That's going to help it to rise. Actually, you can see I've got quite a good bit of aeration in there. It's not ready, but we'll get away with it. We're going to open this up, chuck it in the oven. That oven is at about 200 degrees-ish, but that's not finished, right? This is the important bit. And this is where it comes in really nicely with the ESSE cookers, because you've got a little vent on the back there. You can open it up and steam will escape from the oven. If you leave it closed, it's not vented, so it takes quite a long time for the moisture to get out of the oven. This is why they're really good for baking bread in. All right, because you keep that moisture in there. It's another reason that they're really great for doing roasting and meats and stuff, because they've got that sort of moisture stays in there. All the fancy modern kitchens built of stainless steel that you go into have these ovens where you can add moisture to the cooking environment. Well, these just trap it in there in the first place. So it's, it's just a good way of doing it. So I'm going to get my nice £4.99 from the garden centre. Yeah, nothing fancy going on, no tricks up my sleeve. And I'm just going to spray this in there, get lots of water into the oven, and that's going to give me a nice steam. I'm going to trap that in there by slamming it shut, and I'm going to do that for the next sort of 40 minutes, well, it's not going to be in there, 27 minutes it's going to be in there to cook for, and every sort of 2 or 3 minutes I'm going to put a little bit more water in there. Alright, so I'm just going to set that. Spread it out, oblongy kind of shape we want. Now this is where it gets interesting, because if yours is a bit wetter than this, it's going to make a better baguette, but it's going to be harder to handle. And if it's a bit drier than this, it's going to be much easier to handle, but it's not going to give you such a great result, okay? With me?
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and trap that air inside. Top over first, then I'm just going to layer the bottom out, and I'm stretching it as I push it over, yeah? Bakers have got a couple of sort of fairly flippant sayings that they use quite a lot. The two favourite ones are the wetter the better, and they're talking about the dough, and then the other is that you've got to watch the dough, not the clock. It sounds a bit flippant, but people always say, how long? How long does it go in there for? How long do you leave it to proof for? How long is this? And I think that's our intrinsic sort of disconnection with stuff. We've got so far removed from doing things that we worry about it. So everything must have a time and an exact temperature and an exact quantity. Actually, if you just learn to do it, then the dough will tell you when it's ready to bake. Yeah? Look at that, I've made a bigger one. Alright? That's growing along, look, that's growing already.
Yeah.
I'm feeling quite proud of that.